Hesitant. We are sometimes hesitant. Thus begins my favorite text from the entire history of philosophy. Hello and welcome to Spectres of the Rhizome. Today I am going to discuss the 21st series in the book titled The Logic of Sense by Gilles Deleuze. This series is titled Of the Event, and in it the great French philosopher develops and expresses an ethics around the notion of the event. I will proceed by reading small sections of the text and commenting on them. I can only try to give my interpretation of what Deleuze is saying in this text, which is so beautiful, so powerful, so vitalist, so wise, and so profound that I do not know of any text containing more or better philosophy than what is contained in these 6 paragraphs. The text thus begins. We are sometimes hesitant to call Stoic a concrete or poetic way of life, as if the name of a doctrine were too bookish or abstract to designate the most personal relation with a wound. But where do doctrines come from, if not from wounds and vital aphorisms which, with their charge of exemplary provocation, are so many speculative anecdotes? For Deleuze, designating a way of life as Stoic is perhaps to abstract oneself too much from the concrete conditions of that way of living. However, the Stoic designates the manner in which a way of living is conjugated and conjured in response to the events and wounds which take place in it or on those who live it. However, wounds themselves and the lessons to be learned from them possess a speculative and provoking dimension. What do they speculate? Perhaps they speculate on the forces of a life and on its affects. And what do they provoke, and for what reason? Maybe they provoke something in the depths of our being or of our becoming. Wounds and events provoke the entirety of existence as it is known, so as to give it an impulse towards actualization, reinvention, becoming, and change. To change the states of affairs and the language which expresses them. This provocation is exemplary, because it must be done, it is owed, it is necessary, so that we repudiate the mediocrity of being without becoming, of a being or a life without becoming. Deleuze continues. Joe Bousquet must be called Stoic. He apprehends the wound that he bears deep within his body in its eternal truth as a pure event. To the extent that events are actualized in us, they wait for us and invite us in. They signal us. My wound existed before me. I was born to embody it. This is the first reference Deleuze makes in this text to the French poet from the early 20th century, Joe Bousquet. Bousquet suffered injuries during the end of the First World War, which left him paralyzed for the rest of his life. Out of that horrific event, Bousquet found the resolution to own his own life by giving it his own sense and significance. Bousquet portrayed his new way of engaging with life in his poetry, which Deleuze quotes here. The wounds that one suffers have always existed, even before one was born, and one has not been born with any other reason than to incarnate them, to embody them. We will see further on what this notion of embodying a wound entails. Thus, Bousquet learns from his wound. He learns its eternal truth as event, which is the fact that the wound always existed and that he exists only to embody it. Events are waiting for us as ghosts or phantasms of the future which are haunting the present. Events absorb us, they push us towards them, and they signal at us that their moment will come, or will have come, once the instant of the event has taken place. The text continues. It is a question of attaining this will that the event creates in us, of becoming the quasi-cause of what is produced within us, the operator, of producing surfaces and linings in which the event is reflected, finds itself again as incorporeal and manifests in us the neutral splendor which it possesses in itself, in its impersonal and pre-individual nature, beyond the general and the particular, the collective and the private. It is a question of becoming a citizen of the world. The quasi-cause is a complex, yet not obscure, concept developed by Deleuze throughout this book. It is his concept derived from Stoic philosophy for the relation between two or more incorporeal effects. In Stoic philosophy, only bodies, that is, material things, can be caused in relation to one another. Effects are not causes, or even qualities, they are attributes, or events. Effects do not exist, they rather inhere or subsist. One thus can become the quasi-cause of what is produced in oneself, the operator of the operation of the quasi-cause, by which we act between the line of aion, the time that Deleuze opposes in this book to chronos, that separates bodies from language, or actions from sense. The event finds itself as incorporeal, which means it goes from being like a phantasm to becoming realized, and then becoming a phantasm once again. The event has a neutral splendor in its impersonal and pre-individual dimension, in its reality which is unrelated to us as individuals or persons who experience them, and where they exist in a mixture of all events before having been individuated into singular events. This is why events are never general nor particular, never just collective or just private and personal. They transcend the private because they are immanent to the collective, and vice versa. An event is not just what it means for me or for us, but something that happens between the me and the us, or the them. This is how events allow us and force us to become citizens of the world, and not just inhabitants of a nation or members of a specific society. They reveal the overarching reality that affects us all, as subjects who are subjected by events, but for whom the event is also what allows us to experience an asubjective reality, or a reality without subjectivity. Insofar as the event happens to one, there is no subject. Insofar as we make sense of events, it is we who become subjects of the event, and not longer subjected by the event in terms of necessity. Deleuze then quotes Bousquet again. Everything was in order with the events of my life, before I made them mine. To live them is to find myself tempted to become their equal, as if they had to get from me only that which they have that is best and most perfect. Here, Bousquet is pointing at the paradoxical instance present in each and every event. One makes the events of one lives their own, but to live the events is to be tempted to place us as their equal. Their equal in terms of knowing ourselves, of being capable of giving them our own sense in relation to everything we have lived and thought before the events. The event receives from us what makes them the best and most perfect events possible, that is, the capacity to reconfigure the real and ourselves and to re-signify the events themselves. The events become the best events we could have lived, only because we have lived them and expressed them in our way of living. In the second paragraph, Deleuze begins in the following manner. Either ethics makes no sense at all, or this is what it means and has nothing else to say. Not to be unworthy of what happens to us. To grasp whatever happens as unjust and unwarranted, it is always someone else's fault, is, on the contrary, what renders our source repugnant, veritable resentment, resentment of the event. There is no other ill will. What is really repugnant is the use of moral notions like just or unjust, merit or fault. Here, Deleuze introduces the concept of dignity or worthiness of the event. One must be worthy of what happens to them in order to rise up to the event and make oneself equal with it. Ethics has no meaning other than this for Deleuze. It has nothing to say to us other than the double negative formulation. Don't be unworthy of what happens to you. We externalize the cause of what happens to us when we are ultimately the quasi-cause of what happens to us, in the sense that we have the freedom to choose the sense we give to the events that happen to us. We must, at all costs, avoid to become resentful, as resentment is the willingness to negate the event which has already been actualized. We must also refrain from assigning a moral value to the event in question. To will the event is the beginning of the new and the different. It is the acceptance of the possibilities that the event may bring, rather than remaining within the imagined necessary world that each event is supposed to create. Deleuze continues this powerful paragraph by writing, "What does it mean, then, to will the event? Is it to accept war, wounds, and death when they occur? It is highly probable that resignation is only one more figure of resentment, since resentment has many figures. If willing the event is, primarily, to release its eternal truth, like the fire on which it is fed, this will would reach the point at which war is waged against war. The wound would be the living trace and the scar of all wounds, and death, turned on itself, would be willed against all deaths." To will the event is not simply to accept the event, as that would be a form of resignation before the event, and hence a form of resentment. Resentment, a concept which Deleuze borrows from Nietzsche, was defined by the latter as a reassignment of the pain that accompanies a sense of one's own inferiority or failure on to an external scapegoat. Thus, to be resentful of an event would be to see oneself as inferior to the event. The event is too much for one to handle it, too much to reconfigure oneself in response to it, and to assign blame to the event for our very sense of inferiority towards it. Willing an event has to do with releasing its eternal truth, and this will turns the event against itself, against what it was supposed to necessarily mean for us. The wound becomes a scar for all wounds, for those we've experienced and even for those we haven't experienced, a scar for any potential wound that can be related to that wound. Death must also be willed, but how so? Deleuze continues, "We are faced with a volitional intuition and a transmutation. To my inclination for death, said Bousquet, which was a failure of the will, I will substitute a longing for death, which would be the apotheosis of the will. From this inclination to this longing there is, in a certain respect, no change, except a change of the will, a sort of leaping in place of the whole body which exchanges its organic will for a spiritual will. It wills now not exactly what occurs, but something in that which occurs, something yet to come which will be consistent with what occurs, in accordance with the laws of an obscure, humorous conformity, the event." Bousquet expresses how the failure of the will is linked to a fondness or inclination towards death, and how he substitutes or supplements this failure with a stronger longing for death, which is the result of a celebration of the will. One's will must exert a leap beyond its bodily will to a spiritual one. This leap leads us to identify that which is truly important or vital about the event. The event, once willed, becomes a temporal paradox. It is only after the event that we can give it its sense. Only then can we know what the event could possibly mean, instead of just what it's supposed to mean from the start, even if the ultimate meaning could only be reached in relation to the original meaninglessness of the event. This meaninglessness of the event is its comedic quality and its conformist quality. It makes the event irrisory and attaches the event to the production of the same, of a reality that remains the same. Deleuze goes on. It is in this sense that the amor fati is one with the struggle of free men. My misfortune is present in all events, but also a splendor and brightness which dry up misfortune and which bring about that the event, once willed, is actualized on its most contracted point, on the cutting edge of an operation. All this is the effect of the static genesis and of the immaculate conception. The splendor and the magnificence of the event is sense. The event is not what occurs, an accident. It is rather inside what occurs, the purely expressed. It signals and awaits us. Here, Deleuze begins by mentioning another concept developed by Nietzsche, that which he named amor fati, loving your destiny. For the idea of loving one's destiny aligns itself with the struggle of those who are free, those who become free of the specific and concrete determinations which the event was supposed to oppressively produce. We become free in loving our destiny, in willing that which happens to us. Each event contains a portion of misfortune, but also a splendor which annuls the misfortune, as our willingness for the event to have happened reactualizes the event at the edge of an operation. This operation taking place between bodies and sense, or between state of affairs and prepositions. This operation is the product of static genesis, i.e., the generation without movement of a new sense in relation to the event. The event does not change, but sense is the splendor, the greatness of the event, as it elevates the event to the category of event, of actual and real event, beyond its chance occurrence as a mere accident. The event is folded within the accidental nature of the accident. It merely requires that it be expressed with the sense that one can assign to it and extract from it. The event, essentially, waits for us, but it waits for us to do something with it, something that will change its nature in relation to us and our nature in relation to it. Deleuze concludes this paragraph by returning to Bousquet. In accordance with the three preceding determinations, it is what must be understood, willed, and represented in that which occurs. Bousquet goes on to say, "Become the man of your misfortunes, learn to embody their perfection and brilliance." Nothing more can be said, and no more has ever been said. To become worthy of what happens to us, and thus to will and release the event, to become the offspring of one's own events, and thereby to be reborn, to have one more birth, and to break with one's carnal birth. To become the offspring of one's events and not of one's actions, for the action is itself produced by the offspring of the event. The event, thus, according to Deleuze-Bousquet, must be understood, willed, and represented in that which occurs, and this process comes in this specific order. This order is to first understand, that is, to comprehend the sense that the event contains within it. And once understood, the sense can then be willed by he or she who suffers or goes through the event. Once willed, the event can be represented, that is, represented, presented once again, only now it is presented in its pure form as event, through its sense by having been willed. The ultimate moral lesson to be learned is that we must become offspring of what happens to us. We must embody the event in its perfection and brilliance, which it only can gain once we give it to it by finding the sense of the event and willing it. We must will not the event exactly, but its sense, its capacity to be interpreted in a manner that reactualizes us as living beings of becoming. Deleuze is so radical as to say that nothing more can be said, nor merely about events, but about ethics as a whole. This is his ethics of the event. We must break away from our natural, carnal birth and give ourselves a new birth in response to every significant event. And we must see ourselves as the offspring of the event instead of as the offspring of our actions, because what happens to us is infinitely more powerful than what we choose to do. What happens to us is more powerful than us, unless we are able to find a sense to it and to will that sense, and in doing so, we ourselves become more powerful than the event. We interiorize the power of the event through our capacity to make sense and to produce a new volitional relation to the world as a result of the event. In the next paragraph, Deleuze begins as follows. The actor is not like a god, but is rather like an anti-god. God and actor are opposed in their readings of time. What men grasp as past and future, God lives in its eternal present. The God is Chronos. The divine present is the circle in its entirety, whereas past and future are dimensions relative to a particular segment of the circle which leaves the rest outside. The actor's present, on the contrary, is the most narrow, the most contracted, the most instantaneous, the most punctual. It is the point on a straight line which divides the line endlessly, and is itself divided into past-future. The actor belongs to the ion. Instead of the most profound, the most fully present, the present which spreads out and comprehends the future and the past, an unlimited past-future rises up here, reflected in an empty present which has no more thickness than the mirror. Here, Deleuze begins by contrasting the visions of time between God and the actor. The actor here being what we become in relation to events, as in an interpreter or representer of what occurs, of reality essentially. Whereas for God everything is in an eternal present, us humans can only experience a limited present which may be vast and profound within Chronos, but which leaves the past and the future as segments outside of it. The actor, however, does not experience the vast and profound present, but the present of the ion, which is instantaneous, a pure instant that divides and is divided into past-future. This is an unlimited past-future, the opposite of God's eternal present, and in it, the present is empty and lacks thickness. Deleuze goes on to describe the role of the actor or actress. The actor or actress represents, but what he or she represents is always still in the future and already in the past, whereas his or her representation is impassible and divided, unfolded without being ruptured, neither acting nor being acted upon. It is in this sense that there is an actor's paradox. The actor maintains in the instant in order to act out something perpetually anticipated and delayed, hoped for and recalled. The role played is never that of a character. It is a theme, the complex theme or sense, constituted by the components of the event, that is, by the communicating singularities effectively liberated from the limits of individuals and persons. The actor strains his entire personality in a moment which is always further divisible in order to open himself up to the impersonal and pre-individual role. The actor is always acting out other roles when acting one role. The role has the same relation to the actor as the future and past have to the instantaneous present, which corresponds to them on the line of the ion. The actor or actress, thus, is always dislocated from chronological time, always anticipating and delayed, even if the representation itself passes through the line of ion without being affected or affecting. It unfolds but never breaks, as it is always going on without splitting itself from its instantaneous unity. The actor does not interpret a character but a theme, by which Deleuze means the sense of the event. To represent the event is to liberate the event from its limitations as a state of affairs affecting a specific individual or a particular person. The actor is open to the impersonal, that is, to the pure and infinite intensities which traverse him or her and which the event brings into motion. The actor is always interpreting other roles, which means that there is no one truth of what we should be in response to an event, and that rather we should engage in the possibility of embodying a different role, as the event liberates us from a fixed identity. Towards the end of the paragraph, Deleuze adds, "The actor, thus, actualizes the event, but in a way which is entirely different from the actualization of the event in the depth of things. Or rather, the actor redoubles this cosmic or physical actualization in his own way, which is singularly superficial, but because of it more distinct, trenchant and pure. Thus, the actor delimits the original, disengages from it in an abstract line, and keeps from the event only its contour and its splendor, becoming thereby the actor of one's own events, counter-actualization." Here, Deleuze arrives at the crux of his philosophy of the actor. There are two actualizations, the natural or cosmic one and the counter-actualization effectuated by the actor. The actor is thus not merely an individual or a person who suffers a particular event. It is the elevation of this individual or person to the role of actor, of interpreter. The actor represents the event, but in a manner which contains only the contour, the overall shape of the event, delimiting the original event and redoubling it. It is a moral imperative for Deleuze that we must become actors, that we must achieve this level of relation with what happens to us, such that we do something back to it, producing a new sense for it, which retains only the best of the event. In the next paragraph, Deleuze begins, "The physical mixture is exact only at the level of the whole, in the full circle of the divine present. But with respect to each part, there are many injustices and ignominies, many parasitic and cannibalistic processes which inspire our terror at what happens to us, and our resentment at what occurs. Humor is inseparable from a selective force. In that which occurs, accident, it selects the pure event. In eating, it selects speaking." Here, Deleuze moves forward his discussion to pinpoint that justice only exists at the level of God, from the point of view of the totality of Chronos. We all experience injustices and ignominies, terrible experiences which act like parasites or cannibals and devour us and want to devour us. These inspire our terror towards what happens to us and our resentment towards what has happened. In humor, there is a selective force by which Deleuze means that with humor we have another weapon to combat events and what happens. Through humor, we select what is worthy and leave out the unworthy, what is the truth of the event and what is its necessary tragedy. He returns once again to Bousquet. Bousquet listed the characteristics of the humor actor: to annihilate his or her tracks whenever necessary, to hold up among men and works their being before bitterness, to assign to plagues, tyrannies, and the most frightful wars the comic possibility of having reigned for nothing. In short, to liberate for each thing its immaculate portion, language and will, amor fati. Here, Deleuze lists what the role of the actor consists of for Bousquet. If we want to be actors of our lives and our events, we must annihilate the tracks or traces of events whenever necessary, and it can be very necessary. We must realize that all the horrors which happen to us may have reigned supreme above us for nothing, for no reason, and with no ultimate or transcendental purpose. We must liberate the immaculate portion of each thing, which means to free the worthy from the unworthy and the comic from the tragic. For every tragedy or for every disaster, there is the possibility of comedy as that which helps the actor to re-establish his relation to the world after the tragedy or the disaster. To develop a new language, one that contains the lessons learned from the event. And finally, we must develop a new will, a will to overcome the event by accepting it as our destiny, and therefore as that which allows us to become actors rather than mere individuals or persons. Following this, Deleuze writes, "Why is every event a kind of plague, war, wound, or death? Is this simply to say that there are more unfortunate than fortunate events? No, this is not the case, since the question here is about the double structure of every event. With every event, there is indeed the present moment of its actualization, the moment in which the event is embodied in a state of affairs, an individual, or a person, the moment we designate by saying, 'Here, the moment has come.' The future and the past of the event are evaluated only with respect to this definitive present, and from the point of view of that which embodies it. But on the other hand, there is the future and the past of the event considered in itself, sidestepping each present, being free of the limitations of a state of affairs, impersonal and pre-individual, neutral, neither general nor particular, eventum tantum. Every event seems to be a tragedy or a wound, but it is not because every event possesses a double structure. The concretization of each event into a state of affairs affecting a particular person is counteracted by the other dimension in which events are purely impersonal, pre-individual, and neutral. This last term is borrowed by Deleuze from Maurice Blanchot. The event is not general, such as a war, nor particular, such as a personal wound. The event exists without generalities or particularities, as it subsists and inheres beyond and before the limitations of the state of affairs, which was supposed to actualize the event. Deleuze continues as follows. It has no other present than that of the mobile instant which represents it, always divided into past-future, and forming what must be called the counter-actualization. In one case, it is my life, which seems too weak for me and slips away at a point which, in a determined relation to me, has become present. In the other case, it is I who am too weak for life. It is life which overwhelms me, scattering its singularities all about, in no relation to me, nor to a moment determinable as the present, except an impersonal instant which is divided into still future and already past. No one has shown better than Maurice Blanchot that this ambiguity is essentially that of the wound and of death, of the mortal wound. Death has an extreme and definite relation to me and my body, and is grounded in me, but it also has no relation to me at all. It is incorporeal and infinitive, impersonal, grounded only in itself. The event relates to a present in Chronos, but also to an instant in the Ion, and it is the second which interests Deleuze, as it liberates the event from the constraints of being merely a state of affairs. The instant is always divided into past-future, which means it is never in the right moment, but it is always in the right now. This is how it allows for the creation of a counter-actualization. We have at once two relations to our lives, one in which we are too powerful for our life, and one in which it is too powerful for us. In the first case, the present which has been created by what occurs to us is not enough to handle our own capacity to counter-actualize ourselves in relation to that present. In the other case, life throws its singularities around with no apparent order or sense, completely unrelated to us and unforgiving to our weaknesses. In that case, life has become impersonal, and the event is always to come, still future, and has come, already past, at once. Then, Deleuze references Blanchot's idea that there are two deaths, one that is always being realized until it comes, and one that never realizes itself. Death is the ultimate event, or rather, every event is like death. This, because death is both related extremely personally to oneself, it is one who dies, not the other, nor the world, and also unrelated to us and impersonal, related only to itself and to its cosmic and comic nature, as the destiny of all living beings. Deleuze goes on. On one side, there is the part of the event which is realized and accomplished. On the other, there is that part of the event which cannot realize its accomplishment. There are thus two accomplishments, which are like actualization and counter-actualization. It is in this way that death and its wound are not simply events among other events. Every event is like death, double and impersonal in its double. It is the abyss of the present, the time without present with which I have no relation, towards which I am unable to project myself. For in it, I do not die. I forfeit the power of dying. In this abyss, they die. They never cease to die, and they never succeed in dying. Death is thus realized, but also cannot be realized, and such is the structure of every event. Every event is a form of death, as it forces us to be reborn, to give ourselves a new birth in response to it, if it really is an event. One cannot throw oneself towards death, because in death we don't die, we lose the capacity to die again or later. The power to die is lost in dying. We never cease to die, and we never succeed in dying. Hence, the never-ending actualization and counter-actualization of every event as a form of death. Deleuze then writes, how different this they is from that which we encounter in everyday banality. It is the they of impersonal and pre-individual singularities, the they of the pure event, wherein it dies the same way it reigns. The splendor of the they is the splendor of the event itself or of the fourth person. This is why there are no private or collective events, no more than there are individuals and universals, particularities and generalities. Everything is singular, and thus both collective and private, particular and general, neither individual nor universal. Which war, for example, is not a private affair? Conversely, which wound is not inflicted by war and derived from society as a whole? Which private event does not have all its coordinates, that is, all its impersonal social singularities? There is, nevertheless, a good deal of ignominy in saying that war concerns everybody, for this is not true. It does not concern those who use it or those who serve it, creatures of resentment. And there is much ignominy in saying that everyone has his or her own war or a particular wound, for this is not true of those who scratch at their source, the creatures of bitterness and resentment. The they of which Deleuze is speaking is the fourth person, which is his attempt at surpassing the logics of two and three persons which can be found in other ethics, such as in the Hegelian logic of recognition between two, or the Levinasian logic of justice between three. The fourth person reveals the dimension where things simply happen, occurring not on some individual or person, but on the infinite series of sense and paradox, and on the infinite series of bodily causes and effects. The fourth person is the experience of the world itself. It is how the world itself experiences events. Events reveal their true sense and dimension when we no longer experience them as particular or general, but as both particular and general, and where there is no space for mere individuals or absolute universals. Wars are private affairs, or the result of private affairs between political leaders and between factions of a society, which can be concretized into specific state of affairs. All types of wounds in fact, come from a war of forces and powers in society and in culture which affect an individual to the point of causing them a wound. It is society as a whole which injured Bousquet, as his wound was not caused by a specific accident he suffered, but by the entire manner in which his society was organized. Private events have their own impersonal social singularities, which means they derive from intensities which are not reducible to the person who experiences them, and which combine in singular manners to cause their specific wounds. But we must not say that war concerns everybody, as this is false. Those who benefit from war, or who serve the purpose of war and warlike singularities, are creatures of resentment. Those who merely scratch their sores, who constantly return to their pains and their wounds, as a way of never becoming actors who counter-actualize the wounds, are also creatures of resentment. Deleuze continues in the following manner. It is true only of the free man, who grasps the event, and does not allow it to be actualized as such without enacting, the actor, its counter-actualization. Only the free man, therefore, can comprehend all violence in a single act of violence, and every mortal event in a single event, which no longer makes room for the accident, and which denounces and removes the power of resentment within the individual as well as the power of oppression within society. Only by spreading resentment within the tyrant forms allies, namely slaves and servants. The revolutionary alone is free from the resentment, by means of which one always participates in and profits by an oppressive order. One and the same event, mixture which extracts and purifies, or measures everything at an instant without mixture, instead of mixing everything together. All forms of violence and oppression gather together in this single event, which denounces all by denouncing one, the nearest or final state of the question. The free man or woman is capable of grasping the event, the truth of the event, which is not its mere facts, and the sense of the event, which is not its signification. The free person comprehends all violence within each act of violence, and all terrible events in a single event, which is no longer accidental, but not entirely necessary, as destiny is not necessity, but rather the possibility beyond the necessary. This event that combines all the events is the one that unites the multiple in its multiplicity. Comprehending the event of events removes resentment in individuals and oppression in society. The tyrant always spreads resentment, as it is the negative affect which reduces persons to slaves and servants of power, and which reduces them to a being without becoming, to persons without the impersonal, and to individuals of need without their pre-individual singular possibilities. To become revolutionary is to be freed from resentment. In this single event of events, there is a purifying mixture which allows to measure each and every event without combining them. It is a purely multiple oneness. To denounce an event, a death, a wound, a war, is to denounce all of them while respecting the singularity of each event. Deleuze then quotes the French poet and writer Claude Roy. The psychopathology which the poet makes his own is not a sinister little accident of personal destiny, or an individual unfortunate accident. It is not the milkman's truck which has run over him and left him disabled. It is the horsemen of the 100 Blacks carrying out their pogroms against their ancestors in the ghettos of Vilna. The blows received to the head did not happen during a street brawl, but when the police charged the demonstrators. If he cries out like a deaf genius, it is because the bombs of Guernica and Hanoi have deafened him. With this quote, Deleuze points to the social and general nature of every event and wound. It is history itself as a whole which inflicts wounds, even personal minor wounds, as every event has its singular social coordinates. Deleuze concludes this series, his term in substitution for chapter within this book, in the following way. It is at this mobile and precise point where all events gather together in one that transmutation happens. That is the point at which death turns against death, where dying is the negation of death, and the impersonality of dying no longer indicates only the moment when I disappear outside of myself, but rather the moment when death loses itself in itself, and also the figure which the most singular life takes on in order to substitute itself for me. Death turns against death in this beautiful formulation by Deleuze. The impersonal dimension of death implies that, in dying, not only I disappear outside myself, but also death itself disappears and loses itself. Life in its singularity substitutes each dying being with death itself, leaving nothing but the trace of the actor, the phantasm of the intensity of that dying being, the pure mixture of the events and the becomings which have composed singularly the life of that being, and which only death respects enough, and not at all, by replacing it with itself. The text we have just read together, and which I have commented on, is to me the best of all texts ever written. I hope I have been able to communicate at least a part of its greatness, and that with my comments I have helped the viewer comprehend something about life and events, maybe even about their own lives and events. And that is all. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing to this channel, as more videos on Deleuze and other philosophers are coming. Regards from the Spectres of the Rhizome.